And the heart of the system is this module in the middle called the core. It's a two-part module. This side is a sync generator, and this side is a 4-channel output amp. The sync generator creates the sync that the rest of the system uses to keep everything in sync, horizontally and vertically and color-wise.
Right.
And if you want to genlock the whole system to an external source, it will genlock to that outside source. Otherwise, it runs internally and it creates the sync on its own for the system. The other half is this output amp, which is actually 4 separate output amps. And the output amp is something I came up with in the 70s as a way of taking any kind of signal you throw at it and turning it into legal recordable video. So it's garbage in, video out.
Okay.
So you can feed it audio, you can feed it video, you can feed it noise, whatever you feed it. It chops the signal voltage-wise into the appropriate size, cuts the timing properly, inserts the appropriate sync, and what comes out the cable then is going to work properly on any monitor, record on any recorder. So it's legal, stable video. And then this one has 4 of these. So you can get a main output and 3 previews, 2 mains, 4 main outputs, however you want to use them. So right now I've got these 2 monitors hooked up to 2 of them. And I have the cable box hooked up to the Genlock in. So we have 1 signal coming in from the cable box and 2 signals going out to the 2 monitors.
So what kind of non-video signals people use through this?
Well, you could feed a microphone in, you could feed a radio in, you could feed any audio signals in. Audio generally in video just looks like a bunch of streaks. It's not visually that interesting. If you analyze the audio in some way, like you create a voltage that follows the amplitude, the volume of the audio, that a lot of times is more interesting because it's a slower moving thing that varies with the volume of the audio. The audio itself generally comes out as just like little streaky lines on the screen. So visually, straight audio's not always that interesting. It depends on the frequencies. To be visually interesting, it usually has to be down around the vertical range, which is 30, 60, 120 hertz, 240 hertz, that general range, or up around the horizontal range, which is up around 15 kilohertz. So
in audio, what is that like?
Audio starts at about 20 kilohertz and goes at 20 hertz and goes to 20 kilohertz. So the very low end of audio is around the vertical range. The very high end of audio is around the horizontal range. The majority of audio is in between, and that's where there's not that much visually interesting in that range. So, you can get things, but generally, since it's not in sync with the horizontal or vertical, generally it just looks like moving streaks on the screen. These inputs have dual-purpose inputs that can take 2 different types of signals on the same connector depending on the kind of cable that you use to connect. So they can take audio synthesizer type signals in the audio range. They can take video signals from my video modules. And both the audio synthesizer and my modules can create signals that are down below audio range down to DC, which is 0 hertz. So that's a signal that doesn't move at all, doesn't go up and down, it just stays at 1 voltage. And above that, it can move extremely slowly. So you can have sub-audio signals that are moving, say, 1/10 of a hertz, like 1 cycle every 10 seconds. And then as you go faster, you get up into the audio range. And then as you go faster, you get past the audio range into the video range. And then that can keep going up to the top end of video and beyond. So these modules actually can accept signals up to well beyond the video range. But by the time they come out, the output amp, that limits it to the standard composite video range. All of these inputs, if you use a mono cable from a eurorack system, it sees plus minus 5 volts on the tip of that mono cable. If you patch from the video outs on one of my video modules, you get plus minus 1 volt on the ring of a stereo 3.5 millimeter cable. And it goes into the same input on the same module, and that module is a stereo connector. So it sees either plus minus 5 on the tip or plus minus 1 volt on the ring, depending on whether you use a mono cable coming from a plus minus 5 source or a stereo cable coming from one of my video modules.
Excellent.
So if we patch, say, one of my oscillators into the output amp, and we crank this sucker down.
So is this the sine wave?
This is a sine wave.
Okay.
So if we take this down to sub-audio, we've now got a sine wave running at 1 cycle every, I'm not sure how many seconds here, every few seconds. So this is well below audio range. And it's just a control voltage that's going up and down at a fairly slow rate. The oscillators have a frequency control knob and a switch for coarse, medium, and fine. With the switch on coarse, you can fairly quickly move through all the frequencies to get to roughly the range that you want. And then you switch it to medium, and you can get then closer to the actual frequency you want. You go to fine, and then you fine tune in the exact frequency that you want. That way you, rather than have 2 knobs for coarse and fine, or a range switch to give you different ranges, it's 1 knob and a coarse, medium, and fine switch, and you can fairly quickly move through the whole range. The knob is a continuous turn, billion turn knob. It turn it as many times as you need to. So as we turn it up, you can see that the oscillator starts going into the flicker range, and then we start getting vertical rate bars. So now we're going at about 60 hertz because we've got 1 bar. And as we go up from there, when we get 2 bars, we're at twice the vertical rate. 3 bars, we're at 3 times. 4 bars, we're at 4 times. And so each time we go another multiple of the vertical rate, we get another bar. And we can keep going up and get more and more bars going side to side until we've gone a multiple of the vertical equal to how many scan lines there are.
And that's when it flips to...
And that's when it flips to horizontal. So eventually, the bars get so fine.
Do you get like a moire kind of thing happening, or does it do...
Well, and then we flip to horizontal. So now we've got 1 bar horizontal.
Okay.
So now we're running at 15,750 hertz, or 15 kilohertz. So now we're running at the horizontal rate. And as we go up from there, we get 2 bars, and then 3 bars, and 4 bars. And now this oscillator is free running. It's not being synchronized to the horizontal. So that's why they're going diagonally and rotating around at all these different angles. If we were to lock the oscillator to the horizontal, then it would be straight up and down, because each scan line, it's starting at the left side of the screen, and the oscillations are then a certain period of time from that horizontal sync, and then the next horizontal sync, it happens again from that same point of time. And so as the frequency changes, the bars are stationary based on the left side of the screen. But if we're free running, then as the frequency goes up, we get bars going in all these different angles. And we're going through them very quickly because we're set to coarse. If we go to the fine mode or even go to the medium mode, you can see them going through all these different angles as they rotate around, going through the frequencies. And each time it rotates around, you add another bar, so you get more and more bars each time. So, we get 10 times, 11 times, 12 times, etc., the horizontal rate. And so those bars get smaller and smaller. And this keeps on going. We can get more and more bars. And eventually those bars start getting tiny to the point of being like pixels. Now, eventually they get so small that in composite video, there's a frequency known as subcarrier. Composite video is made up, color composite video at least, is made up of two signals. There's a black and white component, which is a voltage that goes up and down, where the lower the voltage is, the darker the image is, the higher the voltage is, the whiter the image is. Mixed onto that is a high frequency oscillation called subcarrier. That frequency is so high that you don't really see it in the image. And it's separated out by the monitor or the recorder, and it's used as a way of carrying color information that's mixed with the black and white information. The strength of that subcarrier, the intensity of that oscillation, is the saturation of the color, the intensity of the color. The phase of that oscillation is the hue of the color. So by superimposing that oscillation onto the black and white, you superimpose color onto the black and white. When this oscillator gets up fast enough, it gets to that point where it creates an oscillation at the frequency of subcarrier. And then it starts fooling the monitor or the recorder into seeing colors.
Oh, cool.
Now, it doesn't just give you like one color or like a big solid field of color. It is possible, but to get to that frequency is such an exact frequency that it's extremely difficult to do. It is something you can do, but you'd sit here turning that knob over and over and over again trying to find that one frequency. At this point, what it's doing is it's not the exact frequency, but it's close. So to the monitor, it looks like it's constantly shifting phase. So it's a little off frequency, so it looks like it's going through all the colors over and over and over again. And then you can play around with the getting different frequencies in that kind of range, and you'll get different number of stripes and different patterns of the colored colors going in different directions and stuff like that. But that's all happening just because it's up at that 3.5 megahertz, that really high frequency. And the oscillator will keep going beyond that, and beyond that you get into this kind of very high frequency moire, very fine textures, and then eventually you get to the point where the oscillator, the screen eventually just kind of turns gray. And that happens because now the oscillator is so high frequency that one cycle of the oscillation is smaller than 1 pixel of the video. The composite video goes up to about 5.5 megahertz. This oscillator goes to 6.5 megahertz. So at this point, one cycle of the oscillator is faster than 1 pixel of the video. So
Have you built components that work with PAL?
yes, this system works in PAL.
Check it out. There's
How
a
does the
switch.
color-
There's a switch.
There's a switch here for NTSC or PAL. So, all right. So if we crank this back down to a more reasonable range here. Now, also this oscillator is free running at this point. It's not being sunk to the horizontal, even though it can be made to look like it's extremely stable and not moving. It's still free running at this point. And the reason it's able to be that stable and still be free running is because this is actually a hybrid analog digital oscillator. This oscillator has a digital circuit in it that genlocks to the sync of the system and creates an extremely high frequency internal oscillation that's phase locked to the horizontal sync of the video. And then it takes control voltages as analog signals in, converts them to digital, and controls that oscillator, that digital oscillator, using those converted signals. They in turn get converted back to analog waveforms to come out. So it's analog control in, analog waveform out, but a digital core at the center of it that makes it it would be really difficult to be able to free run and just like be able to make an oscillator like this just slowly drift along. It just doesn't do that when it's pure analog. It's really difficult to make something drift.
It's difficult to engineer it, and it's difficult to do it, to operate it, to do so. That's
Yeah,
for sure.
I mean, with a pure analog oscillator, you would have your finger on the frequency knob just constantly twiddling it, trying to hold it steady.
I see. Okay.
Whereas because this has a digital core, you can set it to drift at a given speed, go out to dinner, come back, it's still drifting at that exact same speed.
Got it.
Now there's a couple of voltage controlled inputs on this. So we have a phase control input. Now phase control doesn't affect the frequency, so it doesn't change the size of the bars in the oscillation, it only changes their position. If we control it manually, you can see it just moving the bars side to side. So if we feed an oscillator in to control that,
So this is another oscillator?
yeah, this is an older version of the same kind of oscillator.
And you're going from the sine wave on one into the, like...
It's actually, yeah, this one's mislabeled. This is the sine and triangle were reversed in the labeling on this. So this is a sine wave out.
Oh, okay.
So I'm feeding the sine wave of this oscillator into the phase control on this one. And this is an attenuator for it. So when I voltage control the phase of this one, it uses that other oscillator to shift this one back and forth. And it's doing it with a sine wave, so it's doing a smooth back and forth. If I did it with a triangle wave, it would have sharp corners. And then it's all up to the frequency of this other oscillator. So if I have it going at a very slow speed, it's, shifting it back and forth very slowly. If I do it at something that's something that's like a subharmonic of the vertical rate, so now it's at 30 hertz instead of 60 hertz, so it's in a different position field to field. It creates that kind of flicker. where in one field it goes one way, in the next field it goes the other way. When it's the same in both fields, then you get it more stable like that. And if it's then multiple times the vertical, then you get repetitions, multiple times happening, top to bottom. So, and we have a scale control over how strong the effect is. We have an attenuator also for how strong it is.
Oh, okay.
So the attenuator gives you a certain amount of control, and then the scale gives you 1 times, 2 times, or 4 times
I see.
to just boost that range. Square wave can be confusing when you do that for modulation, because you're taking this repositioning and you're suddenly shifting one way, suddenly shifting the other way. So when you hit the attenuator,
You got that thing
you
where it
can
looks like they're
see it
slanted.
as you go a little bit, but you go too far and it ends up matching back up,
Uh-huh.
except for the lines in between where it's trying to transition.
I like that.
All right, the scale and the smooth scale. All right, we were playing with phase before, now we're playing with frequency. With frequency modulation, there's a couple of things going on here. First of all, because this oscillator has such an enormous frequency range, it goes from 1/10 of a hertz to 6.5 megahertz, and it's basically one scale. So you can't just voltage control that entire scale. That's just too enormous. And even if you do a huge amount of that scale with a voltage, if you do too large of a scale, the tiniest little noise in your voltage is going to be jumping through a large range of frequencies. So you have to limit how much of the frequency range you're going to be voltage controlling when you do a voltage control of the frequency. So besides having voltage control of the frequency, there's also control of the scale of the voltage control. So the scale is a separate control over the frequency of the voltage control of the frequency. Or the way I've labeled it is modulation and modulation scale. So in order to keep the frequency controls clean when you're not using them, this switch has an off position, and then at that point there's no voltage control over the frequency. Then right now this switch has 2 positions, a smooth scale and a stepped scale. That relates to the scale control, which basically acts sort of like a rotary switch. And the 2 settings determine how many steps there are in that rotary switch. In the smooth scale, you have 256 positions of scale. So you have a lot of fine positions that give you a lot of different scales for adjusting the range for the voltage control of the frequency. In the stepped one, you only have 64 different scales. So there's larger steps as you rotate the knob. The reason for that is if you're manually controlling it, trying to find a discrete position with a knob, it's a lot easier to find that discrete position with only 64 steps, and that way you're not right on the edge between 2 of them and jumping between 2 scales. But there are times where you might want to voltage control the scale, and therefore you might want to have more of a smooth transition between scales. So the switch allows you to have the smoother transitions and voltage control that scale, or have the step scale and manually control it. So if we go to the step scale and we just bring up a little bit of scale, and then we voltage control the frequency a little bit, and actually let's do that with it locked. It'll be easier to see what's going on initially. So we're going to use this other oscillator here. So here's our attenuator over the modulation. And then here's our scale control. So when the scale is down low, the frequency that the voltage is changing it between is like 3 bars versus 6 bars. So it's not going that far. And we can go a little bit higher than that as we turn this up. But as we turn the scale up, then it gets more extreme. And it also depends on the base frequency that you have the oscillator set at, as to how high it gets. You can get this to the point where, actually you should be able to see, usually you can see flickering. Not sure why we don't see any flickering this time.
Is it because you're locked, or?
Apparently. Yeah, because that limited it to once every horizontal, so it couldn't go lower down to the flicker rates. So now we're getting down, in the 1 bar, we're down, way down low, down to like 20 hertz, 10 hertz. And in the other one, we're at, I don't know, 20 times, 30 times horizontal rate. So we're sweeping through that.
It's so cool.
It's up to the speed that we set this modulation to. We can, have it sweep through it very slowly. Or sweep through it very quickly. Or we can actually lock this one.
I was just going to ask you. Can you lock that one? That is cool. That is such a unique effect. I mean, I've never seen something like that, except here.
Okay, so now we're going to take that oscillator and this oscillator.
Look at that.
Okay, so basically the VCA has several modes. It can fade an oscillator up to black, fade it to gray, fade it to white, fade it to a negative of itself, or fade it to crossfade it to a second oscillation. So now this is a separate oscillator. But I just happened to set them both to be about the same angle but different frequencies, because I know from experience that it gets really interesting when you then voltage control that. This can create all sorts of weird little organic kind of combinations by playing around with the different oscillators, the speeds of the different ones, the angles of the different ones. And then the blend between them.
Mm.
Ain't that fun?
It's gorgeous. So to get the fade CV is what you use to get a slightly different edge on the way it's blending between the two.
Yeah, all that's happening right now is if, for example, if we were, instead of oscillators, if we had, oh, wrong one. If we had two cameras,
I'm going to change this one camera so it's more obvious.
yeah.
There we go.
See, right now we're just cross-fading between two cameras with this oscillator.
Whoops. I could only run one camera at once, I guess.
So if I turn the CV down, here's, oh, where did I end up? I got the wrong one again. Okay, somehow I patched this wrong. This should have been here. This should have been here. Okay, so there's our two images. And we're using an oscillator to crossfade between the two images. Okay? Now instead of two images, we just use two oscillators.
No, I see.
And then
Super
balance out how they blend and play with the frequencies or the angles.
So does this also have the combining thing, the VCA or whatever you called it? Does that also have a signal that goes in that controls, like, is that also on a sine wave? Is that why it's blending between the two that way?
Well, this is, right now, this is in crossfade mode.
Okay.
So this is going from one image to another and then back again. In VCA mode, it takes one signal, turns it off, brings it back again. In crossfade mode, it fades one out while it's fading the other one in.
But if you sent like a square wave to it, would it just be one image and then the other image and the first image again?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I kind of what's going on then. Where's the combiner thing? The VCA
This
one?
is the VCA.
Okay.
The two inputs right now are coming from this oscillator and this oscillator. And then this oscillator is the control in here.
I see.
And this is the attenuator for the control. So there's one oscillator, there's the other oscillator. When we get halfway between the two,
You got the combining.
this is the mixture of the two oscillators directly. And then if we control that mixture using another oscillator, then we get that. So that's with a sine wave mixing the two. That's with a triangle wave mixing the two.
Okay.
And then if we turn it down, so we're not completely mixing it one way or the other. Like there, we're not changing it. There, we're 50-50. We're just getting half of both images. If we turn the attenuator up just a little bit, now, and let's use the sine wave because it doesn't have that peak in the middle. Now we've got the third oscillator just moving that 50-50 point a little bit off center, back and forth as it goes. It's not going all the way one way, all the way the other. It's just a little wiggle back and forth from that 50-50 mix. And as we turn the attenuator up, it gets more and more off of that 50-50. If we go all the way up, then there's one point where it's all the way one oscillator and one point where it's all the way the other. But everywhere else, it's some blend in between the two.
I see.
With the square wave, it's all the way one way, all the way the other. But we can still use the attenuator, and then instead of 100% one or the other, it's 25%, 75%, or two other numbers somewhere in between. So it's, with the square wave, it's suddenly doing this. With the sine wave, it's doing this.
Right. So most of the control things on this can take an oscillator also.
Yeah, yeah. Every input in here can take low frequency voltages, audio, high frequency oscillators, or video. You can feed cameras into anything.
Just as an example, Dave could use the camera to cut between the two oscillators.
Instead of fading between these oscillators using a third oscillator, we could feed the TV signal in
so that
it's fading between the two.
How come we're getting color there?
Because it's a color television signal, and the way I
course.
described that subcarrier signal, it's a black and white image with the voltage going up and down, but mixed with that is that very high frequency subcarrier oscillation. The VCA responds so fast that it's responding to that subcarrier, that very high frequency oscillation. So it sees it as a control voltage, and it's adjusting it, adjusting the crossfade up and down over and over and over and over again at basically faster than your eye can see, at like pixel rate. So it comes out looking like color because it's doing that transition using the color information.
I see.
Do you have a color kill on this?
The only color kill in here right now is in the keyer.
Okay, got it.
But there will be a color kill module that'll just be a little utility module with 4 color kills in it.
Okay, cool. Are you thinking, this is not something that I believe you had, but are you thinking of possibilities of some sort of voltage control filter, video rate filter?
It's not a high priority. It's something I've thought about.
Right.
But yeah, I've got a lot of other stuff to do first.
Yep. I do like the key with the color though. It's pretty darn cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting though, the subcarrier would be there with any color TV signal, even if it was black and white. If this was a black and white picture, you would probably get, I guess it wouldn't be variations on the color, but you would still get a color artifact, wouldn't you?
No, if it was a black and white camera or a pure black and white image.
No, I don't mean an actual black and white video signal. I mean a color NTSC signal in which the picture is black and white.
No, because there's no subcarrier in the picture. It's color only in the fact that it has burst. Burst isn't in the picture.
Got it. Understood. Absolutely.
This has color because the color's in the picture.
Totally grok it. Yep.
I like when we get the green and pink and stuff.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, why are we seeing these particular colors though?
We're seeing a certain amount of positive negative that's going on because the oscillators are going black and white. So the colors that are there are showing, like if we just looked at the image by itself, we'd see solid areas of color in some of those commercials, presumably. TV station doesn't die.
Nice timing, TV.
Yeah.
How about the camera? Oh, there it is.
We got it for a second. But like,
Okay, so you can see as an oscillator rolls through one of those areas, you can see it go through two different colors. That's the positive and the negative of that same color.
but like the faces are all either blue or yellow.
Right. They're shifted hue. We can make them by Genlock. The hue control over the Genlock. We can set one of those to be a certain color. The other one will be the exact opposite color. It's a negative version of the same image. And when you get a negative of the image, you get the reverse of the color. So,
Yeah, that's really sweet. Cool. Okay, so let's see here. And then in this same box, you also have the sequencer. Oh, what's the difference with VCA? What is VCA 2, by the way?
VCA 2 is more of a simple utility module. It's something that you would use, for example, if you wanted to control an oscillator that was modulating another oscillator. It's 4 separate.
Okay.
Each one, there's a switch on them to choose whether it's a VCA or a multiplier. Let's just take the simple example here. Okay, we take the TV signal and we're running it through in VCA mode. So it's just taking the video signal and it's fading it out to middle gray and then bringing it back up at full strength. In multiply mode, it's going positive, negative. So it's going down to 0, then back up at negative, then back to 0, and back up at positive. So that's the little slide switch that's here that chooses whether it's acting in VCA mode, where it just fades out the signal, or it's acting in multiplier mode, where it goes positive and negative. Now the usefulness of that is, there's different ways of using it. You can use it as an effect directly, like if you crank up the oscillator, you can get some really kind of nice little textures and things going on in an image. It depends a lot on the content of the image, but like sharp edges will give you these really kind of sharp lines with almost moire patterns happening right on the edges of them. Sharp transitions will give you a sharp positive, negative kind of an effect. Text ends up looking pretty good.
Yeah, I like the text.
And the higher the frequency, the weirder that can get. And you get a lot of like positive, negative kind of flickery things if you stay in interlace modes. It can work right up to the subcarrier rates. So, and the other thing that that these are useful for besides direct effects is as a utility for like creating modulation scales and stuff. For example, if we were to instead of processing video, if we were to say feed an oscillator in, and now we were to use that to modulate another oscillator. So, all right, so let me show if, which one's which here? Okay, so if we take this oscillator and modulate this oscillator directly, we get this effect. So this is the modulation we're getting. Now let's make this stand up so it's easier to see the effect. Alright, so this is the modulation we get just using one oscillator to modulate another. If we run that oscillator through the VCA and use a third one to modulate it to...
Oh, the amount of the modulation is modulated.
Now we've limited that modulation to only happening during a certain portion by the other oscillator. So now this oscillator is limiting that oscillator.
Uh-huh. So which of these are based on what you were doing in the 70s and 80s? Or did you have most of these things?
Yeah, pretty much all of these. The oscillators that I had back then were pretty different. Mm-hmm. I didn't have the digital core oscillators.
Right.
They were all pure analog.
Mm-hmm.
I fantasized about the digital core ones, and I even designed one on paper, but never actually built it. But sequencer is almost identical to what I built back then. The VCA is the same as what I built back then. The crossfader is the same. The keyer is very close. It's got a couple of extra features, but it's almost the same. The input amp is something new. The input amp is the opposite of the output amp. The input amp, because I have this special video format that I use throughout the system that's 1 volt peak to peak, plus and minus 1 volt, that you patch around between all the video modules. The input amp is something that takes cameras or external TVCs and converts that signal into the plus minus 1 volt that's patched throughout the system. In the old days, you had video as a separate path from the control voltage. They were completely separated, so video went through the back as standard 1 volt video, and then through a matrix or a patch bay or something to patch the video. And it went through the video path, and then the control voltage went through the front as a plus minus 5 volt signal through mini jacks. So
but
those
this lets you use
two
the video
paths were separate.
As
this
control.
allows them to be completely intermixed. There's no distinction at this point. There's no separation between video and control voltage. They're exactly the same thing. They're completely mixable and interchangeable. So, which opens the possibilities greatly.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I like that these are so modular, each piece, that, you know,
Yeah.
you can...
Yeah, that's another difference, is that stuff was built as big boxes, and sometimes there were 2 or 3 functions within a box, sometimes the whole box was one device. Whereas this is broken down into the basic functions, and you can mix and match, build a system on what interests you. So you don't have to have, you know, one thing or another thing that somebody else might find interesting if you don't like it. So.
Do you ever create any types of like feedback loops through it, like using
Yeah.
output back in as a control to some level, or like?
Yeah, yeah. This stuff passes signals at such a high speed that those feedback loops create really fine little lines. So it works, but it can be a little weird. All right, so this is a keyer.
So basically, based on certain tones, it fills in.
Yeah, it's a luminance keyer.
Oh, okay.
So it's
So it's
based
bright.
on shades of gray. It's got 2 signal inputs, and you have a switch that you choose whether camera 1 is what you're using as the key source, or camera 2 is your key source. And then you have a key on off, so you can just turn the key off. And you have a key normal reverse, so you can, once you've defined the areas using the key clip, you can swap which camera goes into the 2 different areas you've defined. It's a soft-edged keyer. Right now it's set at hard edge, and the camera has some noise in it. It's a cheap surveillance camera. So if you adjust it for soft edge, instead of it suddenly transitioning from one image to the other, it now blends from one image to the other. And that kind of softens the noise that's happening during that transition, so it now looks like a smoother transition. The same with the subcarrier that was happening in the other thing. The color on the edges as you're going through that transition, the key clip sees that subcarrier as it's detecting the shade of gray, and that puts that subcarrier on the edge, so it puts color fringes on the edge as you choose your shade of gray for the keying.
I see.
There's a switch, however, that allows you to kill that color, and there's a switch that allows you to kill the noise. Now, the way it's implemented right now, it's shifting that key clip over. That's temporary. The final version won't shift that over. But with it filtered now, the color is not on those edges anymore. It's in the image, but it's not on those edges. But sometimes having that color on the edge is really a nice look, so it's not always filtered out. It's a switchable thing. Now, you don't have to just use those 2 images to define the key clip. You also have an external source for the key clip. So we can use a 3rd image to define the key clip. So in this case, we've got the TV. And since I really don't like local television, I think I will take us back to Cartoon Network. Nice big solid areas of color. Works much better. So we can use that 3rd image to define the areas, and then our other 2 images fill the 2 parts that we've defined. But we also don't need to use any image at all to define the key clip. We could be using an oscillator to define the key clip. So, you know, any any voltage that we want. Video, audio, an oscillator can define that key clip. And again, this is a soft edge keyer, so you can see that the oscillator bars are blending from one image to the other. If we go back to a hard edge, then it's a sudden switch from one to the other.
Can you oscillate between which the two video things are keying the other one? Does that make sense?
Say that in a different way?
Well, before you had it so that one video was keying against the other one, right? I don't know if I'm saying that, if that's the right term, but like, is there a way to oscillate between which one is controlling the other one? So like, one of them becomes, the colors of one are a pass-through for the video of the other one, and then it switches over so the other one, the second video, is pass-through
yeah.
first?
The image that's defining the areas is called the key clip image. So it's one of three images. It's either internally one of the two images you feed in, or it's an external image. If you set it to the external image, it can come from anything.
Right.
If we bring it in from, say, the crossfader, the crossfader can fade between any two images. And we could feed those same two cameras over to the crossfader,
I see.
and using an oscillator or a manual control or whatever we want, have that crossfade between those images, feed that into the key clip, and then as we crossfade, that's changing what it is that's defining the key areas in the image.
Got it. Okay.
So now, we also have voltage control over the key clip. So if we go back, say, to this type of keying, this key clip control that I'm doing here manually, choosing the shade of gray, that oscillator could also be adjusting that shade of gray for us. So now the oscillator is essentially turning that knob up and down. So it's moving the shade of gray up and down that we're doing the keying at. We can also key clip using an oscillator, and because it's a sine wave, you know, the key clip still positions. Let's slow that down. The key clip still positions the shade of gray on that oscillator, but we can voltage control that oscillator. And now we create shapes where those oscillators overlap. So now this oscillator is defining the key clip, and this oscillator is changing the shade of gray that we're keying on. So the combination of the two is defining a limited area of a shape. But we can also use another oscillator and modulate that first oscillator. And we don't have to stick with specific shapes. We can put that wiggle back into that first oscillator and create all sorts of wiggly shapes.
It looks like one of those like fancy like transitions they would do like on a 70s TV show. Like,
yeah, right.
Those things that get bigger. Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
I think there's some kid shows still using these
Yeah.
things.
And it's,
I'm thinking of like an I Dream of Jeannie kind of like, you know.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the video toaster used to have a bunch of canned
Oh, sure, yeah.
effects like that.
Yeah, that's right. Everyone had that like
the
in a...
dancing woman going across the screen that was like a wipe effect and different stuff.
What was her name? Kiki?
Kiki.
Yeah, Kiki.
Yep. So, and we have control over the contrast and brightness for both of the areas of the screen, the two different source images. And a lot of these modules have two inputs for each input. So you can hard mix two things into each of the inputs. The output amp has two inputs, and so you can mix two oscillators, two cameras, whatever, just put them straight in. Each of the inputs on the keyer has two inputs, so you can feed two different things in. Sequencer, each input has two inputs. So that was kind of trying to reduce how many extra mixers you might need in a system so that you've already got mixers built into a lot of the devices. So there's some feedback. That's taking the output of the keyer and feeding it back into one of the inputs. And then we can control brightness and contrast. So we get a certain amount of control over that feedback. Now, if you want to get repeating edge feedback, you want to get negative. And then we have to go through this module that makes it negative. It's probably going to go too fast. Yeah, that's going too fast. You can't even really see it. Back into itself, it's happening at about 30 megahertz. So it's about a quarter of a pixel. So we need to run through some other stuff first to get enough of a delay to actually see an effect of
How do you
some kind of a
usually delay things if you need to?
running through modules. Each module adds a certain amount of time to go through something.
There's no like delay module that you can just like crank it down.
It's possible to make one. Yeah, they're not. It's not easy to keep quality and have a variable amount of delay. It can be expensive and complicated or sizable. Somewhere here, I think I still, yeah, here we go. Okay, this is 200 nanoseconds.
Wow.
Variable.
Okay.
So this is a precision delay line that is used in industry. These things actually, back in the day, cost a lot of money. And this is variable, so you could feed a signal in and then get a tap out of it that you could adjust. And I use it for testing to add a little bit of delay and see the effect of the delay. But it's kind of complicated and big and expensive to add 200 nanoseconds of delay.
Yeah.
So, and 200 nanoseconds is only a couple of pixels.
Yeah.
So,
Okay. I see.
Now, if you've got a digital process going on,
Then
once
it would be
you've got
easy.
once you've turned it digital and you turn it back to analog, adding a little memory in, then it's really simple because you've already got the groundwork, you've got the building block there. The memory's really cheap at that point, and just count how many pixels you want to delay it. So But in analog form, adding delay is a more complicated thing and maintaining the quality. You can define a fixed amount of delay and build a circuit that has that amount of delay. If it's very short, you can keep the quality. The longer it is, the more difficult it is to keep the quality. And to have something variable makes it much more complicated.